If I tell you that ghosts exist on the highway, would you believe me? You should, because what happened to my buddy Joe back in October 2019 on Interstate 40 in Arizona still keeps me awake at night. Every trucker knows that stretch of road between Phoenix and Flagstaff, but few talk about mile marker 666. Joe should have driven right past that cursed spot, but he didn't, and that decision cost him everything. Joe Martinez had been hauling freight for 20 years, a seasoned driver who'd seen it all. That Thursday night, he was running a load of electronics from Phoenix back home to Colorado, same route he'd taken hundreds of times before. The October air was crisp, and the desert stretched endlessly under a star-filled sky that seemed too bright, too clear. His CB radio crackled occasionally with distant chatter, but mostly the highway was quiet. Too quiet for a Thursday night on one of America's busiest trucking corridors. He'd been driving for 12 hours straight, fighting to keep his eyes open and his rig between the white lines. The coffee had worn off hours ago, leaving him with that familiar bone-deep exhaustion every driver knows. His plan was simple: push through to Flagstaff, grab a few hours of sleep at the truck stop, then finish the haul home. The dashboard clock glowed 11:47 p.m. as he passed a weather-beaten billboard advertising some long-closed diner. Something about that billboard nagged at him, like he'd seen it before, recently. That's when he noticed the headlights in his mirrors, two pale dots that had been following him for the last 30 miles. They never got closer, never fell behind, just maintained that perfect distance like they were tethered to his trailer. Joe adjusted his side mirror and squinted into the darkness, but all he could make out were those steady lights. The temperature gauge on his dash read normal, but the cab felt cold, unnaturally cold for an Arizona night. He cranked up the heat and tried to shake off the chill creeping up his spine. The CB radio had gone completely silent now, not even static, just an eerie dead air that made his ears ring. Joe reached for the handset and tried calling out on channel 19. "Breaker 19, this is Big Joe eastbound on I-40. Anybody got their ears on?" Nothing. Not even the usual late-night chatter from insomniacs and night shift drivers. He switched channels, tried the emergency frequency, even the trucker channels he knew were always active. Complete silence. Like every other driver on the interstate, had simply vanished. Mile marker 650 flashed past his windshield, then 655. The numbers counting up toward that stretch of highway every driver whispered about. The GPS on his dashboard flickered, showing his location as mile 650, but the sign he'd just passed clearly read 666. Joe blinked hard, wondering if fatigue was playing tricks on his eyes. He'd heard the stories, of course, every trucker had. Strange things happened at mile marker 666. Vehicles found abandoned, drivers gone without a trace. But Joe was practical, rational, a man who believed in brake maintenance and logbooks, not ghost stories. As he crested a small hill, his headlights swept across the desert landscape, catching the reflective surface of the mile marker ahead, 666, and standing directly beneath it, a figure in dark clothing, arm raised in the universal hitchhiker's gesture. The man stood perfectly still, not swaying or shifting his weight like normal people do when they wait. Just standing there, patient as a statue, as if he'd been waiting specifically for Joe's truck. The headlights that had been following in the mirror suddenly disappeared, leaving only empty darkness behind him. Joe's foot moved toward the brake pedal almost without conscious thought. Every instinct screamed at him to keep driving, to pretend he hadn't seen the hitchhiker standing at that cursed mile marker. But truck drivers have an unwritten code about helping stranded motorists, especially out here in the middle of nowhere. The man looked harmless enough from a distance, middle-aged, average height, no visible weapons or threatening gestures. Joe had picked up dozens of hitchhikers over the years without incident. What could possibly go wrong with one more? The air brakes hissed as the big rig slowed to a stop, diesel engine rumbling in the desert silence. Through his passenger window, Joe could see the hitchhiker walking toward the truck with an odd, measured gait. No hurry, no gratitude in his movements, just a calm, purposeful approach, like he'd known Joe would stop. As the man drew closer, Joe caught a whiff of something unpleasant, a sour metallic smell that reminded him of roadkill left too long in the sun. The hitchhiker's face came into view in the dome light, pale skin, dark eyes that seemed too deep, and a slight smile that didn't quite reach those unsettling eyes. The passenger door opened with a rusty creak, and the man climbed into the cab without a word of thanks or greeting. He settled into the passenger seat like he belonged there, like he'd ridden in Joe's truck before. "Flagstaff," he said, in a voice that sounded like gravel scraping against metal. That was it. Just one word, spoken without looking at Joe, his dark eyes fixed on the passenger side mirror. The smell grew stronger now, filling the cab with that nauseating odor of decay. Joe put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the interstate, already regretting his decision to stop. Joe told me later that the first thing he noticed wasn't the smell, though God knows that was bad enough. It was the complete stillness of his passenger, like the man had turned to stone the moment he'd settled into that worn cloth seat. Most hitchhikers fidget, look around, make small talk about the weather, or ask how far to the next town. This guy just sat there, hands folded in his lap, staring at the passenger mirror like he was watching a movie only he could see. Joe tried to convince himself it was just another weird passenger, the kind every driver picks up eventually. The digital clock on the dashboard ticked past midnight as they rolled through the Arizona desert, and Joe made his usual attempts at conversation. "Long walk out there in the middle of nowhere," he said, glancing sideways at his passenger. "You run out of gas or something?" The man didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge that Joe had spoken. His dark eyes remained fixed on that mirror, unblinking, and Joe realized with growing unease that he hadn't seen the man blink even once. That sour smell seemed to be getting stronger too, seeping into the upholstery and making Joe's stomach turn. 20 miles passed in complete silence, except for the steady rumble of the diesel engine and the whisper of tires on asphalt. Joe kept stealing glances at his passenger, trying to figure out what was so unsettling about him beyond the obvious strangeness. The man's skin had an odd waxy quality in the dashboard lights, and his clothes, dark jeans and a black jacket, looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. But it was something else, something Joe couldn't quite put his finger on. Then it hit him. The man's chest wasn't moving, he wasn't breathing. Joe's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he tried to process what he was seeing. Maybe the guy was just a really shallow breather, or maybe the angle was playing tricks on his eyes. He focused on the passenger's reflection in the windshield, watching for any sign of life, any normal human movement. Nothing. The man sat like a mannequin, perfectly still, perfectly silent. Joe's CB radio chose that moment to crackle back to life, filling the cab with static and what sounded like distant voices, speaking words he couldn't quite make out. The sound made him jump, but his passenger didn't react at all. "You okay over there, buddy?" Joe asked, his voice coming out rougher than he'd intended. The static on the radio grew louder, and buried in the white noise, he could swear he heard someone calling his name. "Joe, Joe." The voice was faint, distorted, but unmistakably speaking his name. He reached for the CB handset, but before he could grab it, the radio went dead silent again. When he looked back at his passenger, the man was smiling, not at Joe, but at his own reflection in the mirror. It wasn't a pleasant smile. The next 30 miles crawled by like hours, and Joe found himself checking the odometer obsessively. According to his trip computer, he should have been approaching the outskirts of Flagstaff by now, but all he could see ahead were endless miles of dark desert highway. The familiar landmarks were wrong too. That distinctive rock formation should have been on his right, not his left. His GPS showed his location jumping erratically, one moment placing him near Flagstaff, the next showing him still back near mile marker 666. The speedometer read a steady 65 mph, but it felt like the truck was barely moving. That's when Joe noticed the headlights in his mirror again, the same two pale dots that had been following him before he'd picked up his passenger. They were back, maintaining that same perfect distance, never gaining, never falling behind. He pressed the accelerator, watching the speedometer climb to 70, then 75, but the lights in his mirror stayed exactly where they were. "You see those lights behind us?" he asked his passenger, desperate for any kind of normal human interaction. The man finally turned his head toward Joe, and those dark eyes seemed to reflect light like an animal's eyes caught in headlights. "I see everything, Joe," the passenger said, his voice that same grinding whisper. Those were the first words he'd spoken since getting in the truck, and hearing his own name come from that stranger's mouth made Joe's blood run cold. How did this guy know his name? He'd never introduced himself, never mentioned it during their brief conversation. The CB radio crackled back to life, and this time Joe could hear the voices clearly. Multiple voices, all calling his name, all sounding desperate and afraid. "Joe, don't stop. Joe, keep driving. Joe, he's not human." The temperature in the cab plummeted suddenly, Joe's breath misting in the air as the heater struggled against an impossible cold that seemed to radiate from his passenger. Ice began forming on the inside of the windows, creating fractals of frost that looked almost like reaching fingers. Joe cranked the heat to maximum, but it made no difference. The cold was coming from something that had nothing to do with the Arizona desert night. His passenger was still smiling, still staring at the mirror, and Joe realized with mounting horror that the reflection showed something different than what he could see with his own eyes. In the mirror's reflection, the passenger's mouth was moving, lips forming words, but no sound was coming out. Joe watched in fascination and terror as the reflection mouthed what looked like, "Thank you for stopping, Joe. I've been waiting for you." But the actual man sitting beside him remained silent, that terrible smile frozen on his face. The radio voices were getting louder now, more insistent, and Joe could make out fragments. "Disappeared at mile 666. Never found his body. Still picks up drivers." Joe's foot found the accelerator and pressed it to the floor, desperate to reach the lights of Flagstaff and the safety of other human beings. Joe floored that Peterbilt like his life depended on it, and maybe it did. The speedometer needle swept past 80, then 90, but those headlights in his mirror never budged an inch. Worse yet, the landscape outside wasn't changing. The same rock formations, the same scraggly Joshua trees, the same bend in the road that he swore he'd passed 3 times already. It was like driving on some hellish treadmill, moving at breakneck speed but getting nowhere at all. His passenger sat perfectly still through it all, that frozen smile never wavering, those dead eyes still locked on the mirror as if he was watching the most fascinating show on earth. The CB radio exploded with voices now, dozens of them, all talking over each other in a cacophony of static and desperation. "Joe, listen to me. Don't let him touch you, Joe. He's been dead for 15 years. Joe, you have to get out of the truck." The voices were clearer now, and Joe recognized some of them. Drivers he'd talked to over the years, men who'd disappeared on long hauls and were never seen again. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely keep the wheel straight. The passenger turned his head slowly toward Joe, and when he spoke, his voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, even from the radio itself. "You shouldn't have stopped, Joe," the thing beside him said, and its mouth moved wrong like the words were coming from somewhere else entirely. The temperature in the cab dropped another 20 degrees, and Joe's breath came out in thick clouds that seemed to hang in the air longer than they should. Ice wasn't just forming on the windows now. It was crawling across the dashboard, creeping up the seat backs, turning the entire cab into a freezer. The thing that looked like a man reached out one pale hand toward Joe's arm, and Joe jerked away so violently he nearly sent the truck into the median. "Don't touch me!" he shouted, his voice cracking with terror. That's when Joe looked in his side mirror and saw something that made his blood freeze in his veins. The truck behind him, the source of those persistent headlights, wasn't a truck at all. It was his own rig, his own Peterbilt, following itself down the highway. He could see himself in the driver's seat of the trailing truck, and sitting next to that other Joe was the same pale passenger, wearing the same terrible smile. Both trucks were identical, down to the dent in the front bumper and the company logo on the door. Joe was stuck in some impossible loop, chasing his own tail down a highway that had no beginning and no end. The radio voices reached a fever pitch, all shouting warnings at once, and through the chaos Joe heard one voice that cut through the rest like a knife. It was his own voice, distorted and desperate. "He's not human, Joe. He's been doing this for years. Get out of the truck." Joe stared at the CB handset, then at his passenger, then at the mirror showing his own truck following behind. The thing beside him was no longer pretending to be human. Its skin was gray and mottled now, its eyes completely black, and when it smiled, Joe could see rows of teeth that belonged in a shark's mouth, not a man's. "Every driver stops eventually," the creature said, its voice echoing from impossible directions. "They see me standing there at mile 666, and their good nature gets the better of them, just like yours did, Joe." The ice was everywhere now, coating every surface in the cab, turning his breath into crystalline clouds that tinkled like wind chimes when they hit the frozen air. Outside the windows, the desert had changed into something alien, twisted rock formations that looked like grasping hands, skeletal trees that moved without wind, and a sky that had turned the color of dried blood. This wasn't Arizona anymore. This wasn't anywhere on Earth. Joe tried to slow down, tried to stop the truck, but his foot went right through the brake pedal like it wasn't there. The steering wheel felt solid enough under his hands, but when he tried to turn it, the truck continued straight ahead on that endless, cursed highway. He was trapped, locked in this mobile prison with something that had been dead for God knows how long. The thing laughed, a sound like grinding glass, and reached out again with fingers that were too long, too pale, too sharp. "I've been waiting for you specifically, Joe. You're exactly what I need." "What do you want from me?" Joe screamed, pressing himself against the driver's door, as far from the creature as he could get. The thing's black eyes seemed to swirl with their own dark light, and when it spoke, Joe could see that its tongue was forked like a snake's. "I want what every ghost wants, Joe. I want to be alive again, and you're going to help me." The radio voices were screaming now, a chorus of trapped souls warning him, begging him to fight, to run, to do something, anything. But there was nowhere to run on a highway that existed outside of reality. The creature's hand finally made contact with Joe's arm, and the cold that shot through him was beyond anything he'd ever experienced. It wasn't just the absence of heat, it was the absence of life itself, sucking the warmth and energy out of him like a spiritual vampire. Joe felt his strength draining away, felt his vision starting to blur, felt his grip on consciousness beginning to slip. The thing was feeding on him, drawing his life force into its dead shell. Through the growing darkness, he could hear the radio voices fading one by one, until only silence remained. As Joe's world went black, the last thing he saw was the lights of Flagstaff finally appearing on the horizon, impossibly bright and welcoming. The creature beside him was changing, its grey skin taking on color, its black eyes lightening to brown, its terrible smile becoming almost human. "Thank you, Joe," it whispered in a voice that was becoming more like Joe's own with every word. "Now I can find my next ride." The truck rolled on through the Arizona night, but the man behind the wheel was no longer Joe Martinez. He was something else entirely, wearing Joe's face like a mask, already planning his next stop at mile marker 6666. When the sun came up over the Arizona desert the next morning, Joe's truck was found on the shoulder of I-40, just outside Flagstaff. Keys still in the ignition, engine running, cargo intact, everything exactly as it should be, except for one detail: Joe was gone. The state police figured maybe he'd walked into town for breakfast, maybe had some kind of emergency. But as the hours turned into days, and the days turned into weeks, it became clear that Joe Martinez had simply vanished into thin air. His company kept calling, his family kept hoping, but deep down, everyone who knew the roads suspected what had really happened. I didn't believe the story at first, when I heard it through the trucker grapevine. Hell, we all hear ghost stories on the CB. It comes with the territory when you spend your life on dark highways. But then I started digging into the details, started asking questions, and that's when things got really strange. The security cameras at the truck stop where Joe supposedly bought coffee. They showed him walking in clear as day, but there was no footage of him ever leaving. The kid working the counter that night swore up and down that nobody had come in during his shift. It was like Joe had walked into that building and stepped into another dimension. His wife Maria showed me something that still gives me nightmares. 3 days after Joe disappeared, their home phone started ringing at exactly 2:17 a.m. every night. When she answered, all she heard was static and what sounded like CB radio chatter. But buried in that static, she could hear Joe's voice calling her name, begging for help, telling her he was trapped somewhere cold and dark. The phone company said there was no record of any calls coming into their house. According to them, the phone never rang at all, but Maria heard it every night for 2 weeks straight before it finally stopped. The really sick part is what happened to other drivers after that. Within 6 months of Joe's disappearance, 3 more truckers vanished on that same stretch of I-40. All of them last seen near mile marker 6666. All of them found the same way. Trucks abandoned, keys in the ignition, drivers gone without a trace. The pattern was always identical. They'd pick up a hitchhiker, make it as far as Flagstaff, stop for fuel or food, and then vanish like they'd never existed. But here's the thing that keeps me awake at night. Witnesses at those truck stops said the drivers all looked wrong somehow, like they were wearing masks of their own faces. I started carrying a digital recorder in my cab after that, just in case. And about 8 months after Joe disappeared, I was running a load through Arizona when my CB picked up a transmission that made my blood run cold. It was Joe's voice, clear as day, using his old call sign. "Breaker 19, this is Big Joe looking for a ride to Flagstaff." The transmission was coming from somewhere near mile marker 66, and when I looked in my mirrors, I could see the faint glow of headlights way back in the distance. I put that hammer down and didn't stop until I was across the state line into New Mexico. Other drivers started reporting the same thing. Joe's voice on the radio, always asking for a ride, always broadcasting from that cursed mile marker. But it wasn't really Joe anymore, was it? It was something wearing his voice the same way it had worn his face, using his identity to lure more victims into that supernatural trap. The thing that had taken Joe was still out there, still hunting, still adding to its collection of stolen souls. Every missing driver just made it stronger, gave it more voices to use, more faces to wear. The authorities tried to downplay it, called it coincidence, blamed it on the stress of long-haul driving and too much caffeine. But truck drivers know the truth. We always have. There are stretches of highway where the rules don't apply, where things that should be dead still walk among the living. Mile marker 6666 on I-40 is one of those places, a thin spot between worlds where predators wait for good Samaritans with generous hearts. Joe's mistake wasn't picking up that hitchhiker. It was stopping at the one place on earth where no driver should ever stop. I still run loads through Arizona sometimes, but I take I-17 now, even though it adds 50 miles to the trip. When I absolutely have to use I-40, I make sure my fuel tank is full, my CB is off, and I don't stop for anything between Phoenix and Flagstaff. Not for fuel, not for food, and sure as hell not for hitchhikers. Because I know what's waiting there at mile marker 666, wearing the faces of good men who made the same mistake Joe did. And I know that if I stop, if I let my compassion override my common sense, I'll become just another voice on the radio, begging for help that will never come. Last month, Maria finally had Joe declared legally dead so she could collect his life insurance and try to move on with what's left of her life. The service was beautiful. Lots of flowers, lots of truckers paying their respects to a fallen brother of the road. But as we were leaving the cemetery, my CB crackled to life with a familiar voice. "Thanks for coming to my funeral, boys. See you on the highway." It was Joe's voice, but there was something else underneath it now, something cold and hungry. The thing at mile marker 666 was getting stronger. So here's my advice, and you better listen good. If you're ever running freight through Arizona and you see someone standing at mile marker 66, you keep driving. Don't look back. Don't slow down. Don't let your conscience get the better of you. That's not a person needing help. That's a trap baited with stolen faces and borrowed voices. Joe learned that lesson too late, and now he's part of the bait. Another ghost calling out to drivers on the CB, another soul lost to that cursed stretch of highway. The road took him, body and soul, and it's always hungry for more. You probably think that's where this story ends, but it's not. 3 years after Joe disappeared, I got a call from a private investigator hired by Maria to look into her husband's case one last time. The guy had been digging through old newspaper archives and police reports, going back decades, and what he found would make your skin crawl. Turns out there had been disappearances at mile marker 666 going back to 1987. Always truckers, always the same pattern, always the same mysterious circumstances. But here's the kicker. Every single missing driver had been found eventually, months or years later, in mental institutions across the Southwest, completely catatonic and muttering about the passenger. The investigator showed me photographs of these men, and I swear to God they all had the same look in their eyes, empty, hollowed out, like someone had scooped their souls right out of their skulls. The doctors called it severe psychological trauma, but the orderlies who worked the night shifts told a different story. They said these men would wake up screaming about being trapped in a truck that never stopped moving, about driving the same stretch of highway for eternity. They talked about watching other versions of themselves pick up passengers who weren't human, about being forced to witness their own bodies being used by something else. The really disturbing part, every single one of them died within 6 months of being found, usually from heart failure, like something had literally scared them to death. That's when I realized Joe might still be alive somewhere, trapped in his own mind while that thing used his body like a puppet. The thought kept me awake for weeks. My friend, my brother of the road, locked away in some mental prison while a demon wore his face and hunted other drivers. I started visiting every psychiatric facility within 500 miles of Arizona, showing Joe's picture to nurses and orderlies, asking if they'd seen anyone matching his description. For months, I came up empty, but then I got a call from a facility in New Mexico. They had a John Doe who'd been brought in 2 years earlier, found wandering I-25 in a hospital gown, completely unresponsive. When I walked into that sterile white room and saw him sitting by the window, staring out at nothing, my heart nearly stopped. It was Joe, but it wasn't Joe. His hair had gone completely gray, his face was gaunt and hollow, and those eyes that used to sparkle with life were now empty as grave dirt. He didn't recognize me at first, didn't react when I called his name, just kept staring out that window like he was watching something horrible that only he could see. But when I mentioned mile marker 666, something flickered behind those dead eyes, and he grabbed my arm with strength I didn't know he still had. "It's still out there," he whispered, his voice barely audible after years of silence. "It's still using my face, still picking up drivers. I can see everything it does every night when I close my eyes. I watch it kill them, watch it steal their bodies, and I can't do anything to stop it." The words came out in a rush, like a dam had burst inside his mind. He told me about being trapped in his own consciousness, forced to watch as the creature used his identity to lure victim after victim into that supernatural trap. He'd seen dozens of drivers disappear, their souls added to some growing collection, while their bodies became new vessels for the entity. Joe explained that the thing wasn't just one demon. It was a hive mind, a collective of every soul it had ever consumed. Each victim became part of it, their memories and personalities absorbed into a growing supernatural consciousness that got smarter and more dangerous with every kill. It had been feeding off truckers for decades, maybe longer, using their own compassion against them. The reason it preferred drivers was simple. We're isolated, we travel alone, and when we disappear, it takes time for anyone to notice. Perfect prey for something that needed to hunt without being detected. The worst part was what Joe told me about the other drivers who'd been found in mental institutions over the years. They weren't random survivors who'd escaped. They were witnesses the entity had deliberately left alive to spread fear, to plant seeds of terror in the trucker community. It fed off that fear, grew stronger from the collective dread of drivers who'd heard the stories and drove those dark highways anyway. Every urban legend, every ghost story shared over CB radios, every warning passed between drivers was actually making the creature more powerful. We'd been feeding it with our own terror for 30 years. "You have to warn them," Joe pleaded, his fingers digging into my arm like claws. "Tell every driver you know to avoid that stretch completely. Don't just drive through without stopping. Don't go there at all. The thing is getting bolder, expanding its hunting ground." Last week it was at mile marker 650, and I saw it planning to move to mile marker 680 next month. He was shaking now, tears streaming down his face as he described visions of the creature wearing his face, using his voice, mimicking his mannerisms perfectly as it stood on different stretches of I-40, waiting for the next compassionate driver to stop and offer help. I left that facility with a mission and a terrible weight on my shoulders. Joe was alive, but he was broken, probably beyond repair, tortured by visions of every crime committed in his name. The creature had kept him conscious specifically to maximize his suffering, to feed off his guilt and horror at being unable to prevent the murders. It was psychological torture on a scale that made medieval dungeons look merciful. I reported everything to the authorities, but they dismissed it as the ravings of trauma victims and conspiracy theorists. The creature had chosen its hunting ground well. Who's going to believe stories about supernatural hitchhikers on a lonely desert highway? So I'm telling you this story not just as entertainment, but as a warning. Mile marker 66 on I-40 is still active, still dangerous, and the thing that took Joe's identity is still out there. It's expanding its territory, getting bolder, and it's not alone anymore. Joe confirmed there are others like it operating on highways across the country. If you're a driver and you see someone hitchhiking on a dark road, especially in remote areas, you think twice before stopping, because sometimes the person asking for help isn't a person at all, and sometimes showing mercy can cost you everything, including your soul. Joe's still alive in that facility in New Mexico, but the thing wearing his face is still hunting, and every night it adds new voices to its collection of stolen identities.